Hey there, Scary Stories fans. This is author Kevin Folliard, and today I'm going to be reading the first story in my collection of holiday scary stories, Christmas Terror Tales. The story is titled The Christmas Jack-O-Lantern. Mrs. Fellows was the most extravagant decorator in the neighborhood. Every October, her house was decked out with pumpkins, witches, skeletons, fake spiders, and plastic webs. But Halloween was just the opening act. Once the calendar reached November 1st, she immediately took down all of her ghosts and ghouls and swapped them for lights and snowmen. She couldn't wait to shift holidays and put up the family Christmas tree with all the trimmings as early as possible. The front of the house positively glowed with lights and animatronics. There were elves, Santas, reindeer, the three kings, shepherds, angels, and a nativity scene with every barnyard animal imaginable. Upon the chimney, Mr. Fellows mounted a gleaming Star of David, and the sidewalk was lined with cardboard carolers and mounted speakers playing cheerful holiday tunes. Because of her impeccable taste, Mrs. Fellows was made head of the neighborhood decorating committee, and every December each street competed in a holiday decoration contest. It was Mrs. Fellows' duty to spread holiday cheer by encouraging everyone on her block to participate, coordinate their decorations, and ensure her sterling reputation by winning. One year, after Halloween had ended, and Mrs. Fellows had erected her entire Christmas monument inside and out, she noticed the neighbor across the street had left his jack-o'-lantern on the front stoop. The jack-o'-lantern was expertly carved, with sinister triangular eyes and a wide, jagged grin. She had admired it last week, but now she found the sight of it distressing. "That jack-o'-lantern is overstaying its welcome," she remarked to her husband as she peered out from behind the curtain. "It's almost a week old and it's going to rot." "So what?" Mr. Fellows shrugged from the sofa, engrossed in the TV. "Not everybody switches from Halloween to Christmas like you. There's a whole other holiday in between. Pumpkins are fine for November." "Regular pumpkins are," Mrs. Fellows glared. "Not jack-o'-lanterns. I'm going to have a talk with him." "Let it go, Martha," Mr. Fellows groaned. "It's my job. I'll be polite as peaches." Mrs. Fellows marched across the street, her head held high. She sneered down at the jack-o'-lantern as she knocked upon her neighbor's door. A thin, balding man with a cigarette in his mouth answered. "Yep." "Hello, I'm Mrs. Fellows from across the street. I'm the head of the neighborhood decorating committee, and I couldn't help but notice this charming little jack-o'-lantern." The man grinned and took a puff of his cigarette. "I'm proud of this little bugger. Carved him myself." "Of course, you have quite a talent." Mrs. Fellows clicked her tongue from behind her barred teeth. "I just thought I'd remind you about the Christmas decoration contest. You've only lived on our street a few months, and it's coming right up." The man flicked ash down onto his front stoop. "And, well," Mrs. Fellows cleared her throat, "it seems that this little guy is rotting, and we want to have a strong presentation from now until Christmas." "It ain't Christmas yet." The man gave her a cockeyed glare. "And he ain't rotten. Looks fine as can be." "Well, he'll be rotting soon." Mrs. Fellows tossed her hands in the air and gave a haughty laugh. "Just a friendly reminder." "Afternoon." The man slammed the door in her face. Mrs. Fellows glared at the smiling jack-o'-lantern and crossed the street in a huff. All November long she coordinated with her friends in the decorating committee. Many of them followed her example, putting up their Christmas decorations early, and each house that Mrs. Fellows advised became a shining example to the other neighbors. But the jack-o'-lantern across the street remained. To add further insult, the man even had the nerve to light it at night. Its terrible grinning face glowed at her beautifully decorated home all evening long. She waited and waited for the jack-o'-lantern to rot and collapse. But strangely, it did no such thing. It remained as sharp and sturdy as it had been in mid-October. "It must be plastic," Mrs. Fellows deduced one night as she studied its gleaming eyes and mouth. "It's a plastic jack-o'-lantern with a bulb inside. Not sure how I didn't notice that." "Stop obsessing over that darn jack-o'-lantern," Mr. Fellows snapped. "The man can decorate his house however he wants." "It's a mockery of the spirit of the season," she insisted. "It isn't even Thanksgiving yet," Mr. Fellows said. "He'll put it away at the end of the month." "He had better," Mrs. Fellows snapped. The day after Thanksgiving, Mrs. Fellows waited anxiously by the window for the man to take in his jack-o'-lantern. But when night came, and the eerie glow of its mouth and eyes lit up the man's front stoop, she became incensed. She stalked across the street and rapped upon the man's door. The man's eyes glazed over when he saw her. "'Tis the season to be jolly," Mrs. Fellows sang. "Not spooky. Halloween is over, Thanksgiving is over, it's time to take our little friend inside." "How come?" the man said with little interest as he lit up a cigarette. "Because Christmas comes but once a year, and everyone in the neighborhood competes to have the brightest, most cheerful displays. You know, I have an old wooden sleigh I don't put out any more that you could borrow, and we have plenty of lights we could loan you. My husband would put them up on your bushes." "No, thanks," the man smiled. "I'm happy with my little guy here." He took a long drag and flicked his glowing cigarette onto his lawn. "Good night." He shut the door. Mrs. Fellows growled under her breath. She stooped down to examine the hideous jack-o'-lantern. It didn't appear to be plastic at all. She peered inside its devious, jagged mouth to see if it was lit by a bulb or a candle, and could only see a bright yellow glow. As she stood up to walk away, something viciously clamped onto her ankle. Mrs. Fellows screamed as the pumpkin's mouth pierced and burned her skin. She kicked and shrieked until it finally released her foot. She hobbled across the street, panting and moaning, and raved to her husband when she returned. "That horrible jack-o'-lantern across the street bit me!" Mr. Fellows examined the burns and puncture marks on her ankle. "You've got to stop obsessing about this jack-o'-lantern. It's making you a little nuts." "But look at what it's done!" "You probably stuck your foot in there by accident. It's full of candles, I'll bet. You've got to leave this whole thing alone." As it turned out, Mrs. Fellows had twisted her ankle escaping the jack-o'-lantern, and spent the month of December hobbling about on a cane. All month long, the jack-o'-lantern remained on her neighbor's front stoop, glowing and grinning at her from across the street. Her husband and the doctor refused to believe her, but she knew better. When she turned her back on it, she could almost hear it snickering like a naughty little trick-or-treater, refusing to accept that Halloween had come and gone. It made her furious. Not celebrating Christmas was one thing, but this man's insistence on leaving his little glowing friend out there to bite the neighbors was an act of war. When the first snow fell, the jack-o'-lantern's face glowed resiliently behind a white pile, slowly melting a little puddle around it. Its fire would not die, its flesh would not rot, and its nasty little grin would never quit. Every other house on the street had put up their Christmas decorations by now, but the jack-o'-lantern remained the one eyesore staining their perfect holiday paradise. Mrs. Fellows had never lost the decorating contest, and as head of the committee, it was her duty to ensure perfection on her street. The man and his jack-o'-lantern had assaulted both her and the neighborhood, and she would make them pay. "I want you to go out there in the middle of the night and smash it," she instructed her husband. "Smash it to bits, but be careful because it has razor-sharp reflexes." "You're getting goofy, Martha," Mr. Fellows said. "If you don't cut this jack-o'-lantern nonsense out, I'm calling the men in white coats to take you away." Mrs. Fellows decided that if her husband would not help her, she would take care of things herself. She crafted a polite but firm note using letters she cut out of her decorating magazines, warning her neighbor to remove his jack-o'-lantern before the night of December 18th, the night before the decorating committee passed judgment. On the morning of the 18th, Mrs. Fellows found several of her cardboard characters in shambles on the front lawn. Jagged triangular shapes had been bitten out of them, decapitating children and mangling angels. An animatronic chicken was missing from her manger scene as well. Mrs. Fellows' eyes tracked its vinyl feathers across the street to the devious, glowing grin of the jack-o'-lantern. She had had enough. That night at midnight she hobbled across the street and stood within arm's reach of the terrible little monster. She planted her feet as best she could, raised her cane high into the air, then struck downwards with all her might. The jack-o'-lantern rolled onto its back and bit her cane ferociously, dripping hot spittle upon the wood, setting it ablaze. She screamed and fell backwards in the snow as the jack-o'-lantern chomped her cane into cinders. She shouted and cursed as she struggled forwards and grabbed the hideous creature's jaws with both hands. Her fingers burned in the jack-o'-lantern's blazing mouth as she pried its upper and lower jaw open as far as she could until the entire pumpkin pulled apart in an explosion of orange flesh and yellow fire. Her hands bled and burned, and her ankle throbbed as she sat in the snow amidst the remains of the jack-o'-lantern and chuckled triumphantly. She climbed back onto her feet and limped as best she could towards the street, laughing all the way. As she struggled across the street without her cane, she came upon a slick patch of ice and slipped onto her back, hitting her head hard. She lay helpless in the middle of the road, unable to get up. She turned towards her immaculate house and smiled with pride at the colorful city of holiday cheer. Then she slowly turned her head the other way, feeling extraordinary relief that she had purified the neighborhood just in time for Christmas. The front door of the neighbor's house slowly opened, and the man stooped down, placing a brand-new jack-o'-lantern with the same jagged smile on his front stoop. He lit a cigarette, then discarded the match into the pumpkin's mouth, lighting it with a bright yellow flare. He grinned and waved as he took a long drag of smoke. "Happy holidays!" he called out from his front door. Mrs. Fellows moaned in frustration and tilted her head back on the icy concrete as she drifted into unconsciousness. Christmas Terror Tales is available through Amazon.com in both paperback and Kindle, and you can also find us on Facebook. Happy holidays!